welcome. The first thing I want to talk about is aspect ratio. What is aspect ratio? Simply put, it's the ratio of the width and height of your monitor. An example of aspect ratio would be a 1:1, where every unit of horizontal measurement is equal to every unit of vertical measurement. A video game related example would be using an aspect ratio of 4:3, meaning for every 4 units of horizontal measurement, there are 3 units of vertical measurement. 4:3 will then create more of a square shape, something you would see with earlier video games, when that was the only aspect ratio around. Using 4:3 gives your game a very nostalgic aesthetic. Today, mostly everything is 16:9, but there is no one set rule. 16:9, however, appeals to most monitors. Now, what about resolution? Resolution is the total number of pixels used by the monitor. Today, monitors can support millions of pixels, which isn't really an issue. Aspect ratio is a preference, and when it comes down to it, supporting multiple monitors is nice, but it's your choice. Where 4:3 used to be the standard, 16:9 has taken over. So what if we could appeal to both, 4:3 and 16:9? Best of both worlds, right? So that's exactly what we're going to do. You can also apply most of what we're about to do in software like GameMaker Studio 2, Godot, or Unity 3D. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to load up Construct 2, we're going to go File, New, and we're going to make a new retro style project. If you're using Construct 3, just follow along the same way. The only reason I'm not using Construct 3 is it's not in stable yet, it's still in beta, and I don't want my project to crash on me. So using Construct 2 just gives me that stability. And if you're using Construct 3, you can open up any Construct 2 file. So now the first thing I need to do here, before we get into actually setting up our aspect ratio, is I need to set up the project. So RetroStyle template is for a pixelated game, which is what we're making. And we actually have to kind of change some of the properties in the RetroStyle template. So right here I have the properties bar open. If you don't, go to View and then click on the properties bar. Or if you've clicked on the layout, you see here that now you're viewing the layout properties. Go right over here to Project Properties and hit View. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn off pixel rounding. I can double click or I can just drop this down. Pixel rounding actually snaps each object at an integer position versus a float, and for a pixelated game, that is going to make it jitter, and that has cured many issues, especially with collision for me in the past. What we're really going to be dealing with is our window size, but we'll get back to that in 1 second. So the next thing I want to do is go under Configuration Settings and go to our Preview browser. What I want to preview with is nw.js or Node WebKit. So if you're using Construct 3, this should already come with, and you can kind of just hit play, and that's what it should preview with. But for Construct 2 here, we actually need to download this separately. So if you haven't done that, type in nw.js for Construct 2 in Google, and you can just download the first one. And once you install nw.js, you can hit play up here, and it should load an actual window. Now this is useful if you want to develop a game for a platform like Steam or itch or anything like that where it's a downloaded desktop game. So the next thing I want to do here is I want to change the full screen scaling from low quality to high quality. So at low quality, this text would look extremely blurry. If I zoom in here, you can kind of see how it looks blurry. But if we make this game full screen, which we will in the future, this will now fix that issue. And for a pixelated game, just to be able to use text instead of always having to use a sprite font, that's going to come in handy. So let's go back to our properties here and let's see what else we need to change. I think that is it. I'm going to change one more thing though. So our layout size actually doesn't matter. A lot of people get that confused, but it doesn't. But you'll notice here that I kind of just messed up the layout size, which is totally fine. I'll hit Control Z. You'll notice here that when I zoom out, or just when I try to pan, I'm very limited with these margins up here. So I'm actually going to mess around with these margins. I'm going to make them, I'm just going to add a 0, 5,000 by 5,000. So now when I pan around, I actually have some room to develop my level here. But again, the layout size, it really just, it doesn't matter. So let's actually look back at the project properties here and let's actually start talking about the window size and the aspect ratio. So by default, the RetroStyle project sets it up as a 320 by 180 window. And if I hit play again, you're going to notice that this is pretty small. This is a very small window, but you want that because with pixelated games, you're going to be able to scale this up for other monitors for a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. So how can we take this and how can we scale this up effectively, and how can we make this, when we hit play, how can we actually make this adjust itself so it's actually viewable? There are a few things that we have to do, but the first thing I want to do here is go into our event sheet and make some global variables. So let's hit V on the keyboard in our event sheet, and the first global variable I'm going to set is going to be called resolution width. I'm going to make this 320, or the width of our window size. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit V on the keyboard again and make resolution height. So this is going to come into play a bit later when we actually go to switch these from a 320 by 180 or a 16 by 9 aspect ratio to a 4 by 3. The next thing I want to do is I want to make two more variables. I want to make my scale, and for the default value I'm going to give it 4, and I want to create my target, and for the default target we're going to make this 720. So we're going to do a little bit of math, but it's very basic math here, just so you can see how I'm getting these numbers and what I'm doing here. So I'm going to bring my calculator in. And as you see here, actually I'll go for the target first. Our height is at 180. Now if I multiply that by 4 and hit equals there, I'm going to get 720. Let me clear this. And if I go 320 times 4, I'm going to get 1280. In other words, 720p. That might be a phrase that you're used to. 1280 by 720. So if I keep scaling that up, let's go 5, 1600. That's also going to be a valid 16 by 9 aspect ratio. Or if I go to 6, then I'm at 1920 by 1080. So you can see how with these global variables, we can actually just change these on the click of a button, and we can change our window size and our aspect ratio and the resolution. So let's do this. Now that we have these variables, let's actually start to add them in to the game. So the first thing we're going to do here is double click, hit system, and we're going to make our start of layout. This is kind of how I always like to make my event sheets. I put the start of layout first, and I'm going to double click, go system, and just for later, I'm going to add in my every tick. And these two are usually the first two to start off my event sheet. I try to have only one start of layout where I can. I think that way it just kind of creates a very centered place to have all of your code. But every tick you might have to have in a couple of other event sheets. We're going to come back to the every tick later. I just thought I'd include this, as this is kind of how I always set up my event sheets to start out with. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to go back to the layout, and we're going to double click, and we're going to add the function object to our project here. So I'm going to double click on this, and this will give our project the ability to use the function object and create functions in our code. So the first thing I want to do here is I actually want to, on the start of the layout, call a function. So let's click on the add action, double click on function, call function, and we're going to name this function set underscore ratio and resolution. Okay, so now that we've called this function, we actually have to make this function exist. And this is going to happen when this layout loads. So let's add a new event, and let's go into the function, on function, and now let's copy the name, set ratio and resolution. So now when the start of the layout loads, it's going to jump to our code right here and call whatever we want. So bear with me, because if you've never programmed before, if you've never used Construct 2 before, or Construct in general, this might be a lot thrown at you at once, but this is definitely going to give you a better foundation. For some reason, aspect ratio tutorials, there's not enough on how to set them up for our games here. So if you have to, I would say go back and watch this tutorial again, or just continue on through, because it's going to get easier as we go along. So what we're going to do here is we are going to add an action here, and we are going to go system, set the canvas size, and actually if you see here the definition that Construct 2 gives us, it sets the size of the canvas also altering the window size project property, which is great. What we're going to do here is we're going to set the width and height to our global variables. I'm going to type in resolution width, and I'm going to type in resolution height. Cool. So that's not all that we have to do. We have to do a few more things to actually tweak the desktop version. Now that we have this in there, though, no matter what version you're using, the canvas size will now change. But to tweak the desktop version specifically, we have to actually go back to the layout, double click, and add the nw.js object. I'm going to double click on that. And if you see other plugins that I might have, don't worry about them. They're just plugins that I've tested over the years. And if you wanted to add them and try them out, you could. Okay, so now that we have the nw.js object in our project, let's set the width to match our resolution width. So let's go nw.js. We're going to set the width, and we're going to match the resolution width. And this time now, we're going to actually multiply it by our scale, not for, by our scale. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to make it, let's see here, 320 times 4 equals 1280. So it's actually going to make it 1280, and then we're going to do the same thing for our height, which will make that 720. So let's do the same thing. We're going to add the action, go to nw.js. We're going to set the height of nw.js, which again is our little desktop window. We're going to set that to, as you probably have already guessed, resolution height times scale. Pretty easy so far. The next thing we're going to do, and this is entirely up to you, is we're going to actually reset the x and y of nw.js, because once you do this, it kind of throws it for a loop, and the actual window will pop up anywhere around the screen. Not really the biggest deal, but again, entirely up to you. So the way we're going to do this, I actually found this trick using the Metroidvania pack, which is really cool, off of skira.com. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go system. We're going to wait for a second, or 0.1 seconds. That way it just gives nw.js a second here to load. And we're going to set the nw.js object. We're going to set the x to, now here's what we're going to do. We're going to grab the browser object, because underneath the browser object we have all of these parameters or properties here. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab the screen width, which is actually the number of pixels on my screen. We're going to divide that by 2, and we're going to subtract nw.js.windowWidth, and we're going to divide that by 2. If you're completely lost here, don't worry about the math too much. This is just setting up the aspect ratio, or no, this is just setting up the x and y to actually center, and I'll show it to you in a second. I'm going to add the action for setting the y here. So browser.screenHeight divided by 2 minus nwjs.windowHeight divided by 2. Okay, so we're almost done. We're almost there, at least in terms of initial setup here. So right now what's happening is on the start of our layout, we are calling set ratio and resolution. And in this function so far, we're setting the canvas size, which is this guy, or this guy. We're setting the canvas size to whatever this is, and then we're setting the window size to this times 4. So we're already scaling it up. And then we're just making sure that we adjust it to the right position of the screen. So I don't think anything bad will happen if I hit play here. In fact, it didn't. So great. Here's what we have. Because we have that full screen scaling set to high quality, we can actually read this text. For the most part, when it loaded, it put it to the center of my screen, and it made it 4 times the size of what it already was. So to double check the size here, what I can actually do is I can actually set this text in the everytick. So we will end up using the everytick in this lecture. We're going to set the text to nwjs.windowWidth, and I'm going to put a little x there, and nwjs.windowHeight. Okay, so when I do that, and when I put that in the everytick, it's going to run every frame per second. So even when I resize this window, it's going to tell me what we're at, which is pretty cool. So we started out at 320 by 180, And now, because we've multiplied that by 4 and scaled it up, we are at 1280 by 720. And you see that little delay in NWJS loading there. That's actually putting it back into the center of my monitor. Okay, so now that we have our resolution kind of scaled up and our aspect ratio set, how do we switch between a 4:3 aspect ratio and what we are currently at, which is a 16:9 aspect ratio? To do this, I'm going to start by getting a little bit organized here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select our function. I'm going to hit G on the keyboard, or I could right click, add a group. I'm going to call this our aspect ratio. Probably going to be in your best interest to organize your code as much as possible as you go through. I think when it comes down to prototyping, you just kind of want to get it going, but the more you group things together, the better. Also, if you hit Q on your keyboard, you can make a comment, so I can say this is the switch and scale function, essentially, where we're setting it. And what I'm going to do now that I have this group, is I can hit B to actually create a blank event, and I can drag that up here. So knowing some of the shortcuts come in handy. So what I want to do here is I want to be able to switch between 320 by 180 and another resolution for 4:3. Now there's so many different resolutions you could be using here. We're going to pick a very common one. So to toggle this, I'm going to double click on this blank event. I'm going to go into my keyboard, and on key pressed, I'm going to set this to K or L. K. We're going to go with K. I'm going to copy and paste this, and then I'm going to set this one to J, just like that. And between these two keys, which I'm not really going to be using too much, I'm just going to be able to set these ratios. Now, we're going to actually improve on this feature later on in Enhance Your Platformer, but for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to get these to work. So here's how we're going to do this. When we press the K key, we're going to add an action for the system to set the resolution width to something that is 4:3. In this case, we're going to go 240. And then I'm going to set the resolution height to be 160. Now, this is good, but we actually need a target. So 720 was our target before, and we actually haven't used our target yet, but we will in a second. 720 was the target scale, because when we're multiplying by 4, that's what we get, 1280 by 720. We're going to now change our target to be something that is acceptable for a 4:3. So system, set the value of the target to be 640. So this times 4 is 640. And then what we're going to do finally here is we're going to call our favorite function. So I could either go in here and retype that, or I could just hold down Control, click, and drag and copy it from before. So now what I can do is I can actually click and Shift, Control C, and Control V, and I can just set this back. So I'm going to set the resolution width here to 320 by 180, and then our target is 720. So now to utilize a target, we're actually going to do something that I don't do too often. I'm going to actually make our function into an OR statement, because this code can be run either with a function call or if this event were to run. So to do this, I could either right click on this and make it an OR block. Nothing's going to happen until I add another condition, or I could hit Y on my keyboard. Now to add another condition, you see here that there's this margin, and this margin, when I click right over here, I can actually zoom in so you can see this. When I click over here, that's going to highlight the entire event, but when I click over here, I'm just selecting the condition. So I'm going to copy and paste this, and when I do, you can now see that this has now become an OR block. By default, everything is an AND block. And I actually don't want to call the function again, because that wouldn't make sense. So I'm going to just go through the function and go back. I'm going to go to System. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to compare two values, which is a very useful function to just kind of pick two objects and then compare them. So what I'm going to compare here is I'm going to grab NWJS. I'm going to compare the window width, and I'm going to make this less than our target width, just like that. Now that way, if it for some reason is less, it will also run this code. So now that we have all of this set, we can hit save if you haven't already. And when I hit play here, we should be able to toggle between K and J. So I'm going to hit K on my keyboard, and just like that, I have a 960 by 640 aspect ratio. And if I go hit J, now we're at 1280 by 720. So this is really, really powerful and important for your game to set this up this way, I think. I mean, it is completely your preference. If you're trying to create an old school game, then maybe you just want to set this as 240 by 160 over here and call it a day and scale it up. But having both options is going to appeal to most people, even though you might ruin the aesthetic by having a game 16 by 9 if that's not what you're going for. I've seen comments before where people aren't happy if your game's only 4 by 3. And I've actually never seen a comment where they're upset if it's only 16 by 9. But if it's only 4 by 3, then people can kind of get angry from what I've seen. So you might as well add it in both. So that's how we do that. I know this was a long and boring lecture, so thanks for hanging in there. At least now we know how to do that going forward. There's a few more things that I want to add to this when we enhance later on. But for now, great job with this. I hope you were able to follow along and really learn something from this. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. In this lecture, we're going to add in our tile map. Now, before we do that, I want to just remind you that our layout size can be anything we want it to. Right now, my layout is at 1280 by 1024, and this is just completely optional. It could be as long as I want or as tall as I want. In this case, a good rule of thumb here, just when you're starting out, might be to set it to be the same size as your window. And the benefit to doing this is actually long-term. You know how we have this set to our window size on the every tick from our aspect ratio? Well, that's technically a UI element, and the only way a UI element will display is if it's within the window size. So anything outside of the window, it won't display as a UI element. So having this here as a little guideline of where I can put any type of UI element is actually really, really helpful. There are other ways you can do this, but we'll explore those later on. So now that I have that set, how can I design outside of this layout, and is that even a thing? The answer is yes. So what I want to do here is I just want to click on our layout again, go into our layout properties, and change unbounded scrolling from no to yes. So this will allow us to design past this little white box here, and we can kind of use all of this real estate and just go to town with our design. Now, this is optional. You can not have it be this small, and you don't have to have unbounded scrolling on if you don't want to be able to scroll past the edges, but then you have to design within this box. If I make this just twice this, if I make this 640 by 360, you can see that there's our window size with the dotted line, so over here, our UI element wouldn't show. But I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to design outside over here with our tile map. So to do this, I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to add a layer to the bottom, and I'm going to call this map. Now you're going to notice that I already actually added in our tile map object. To do this, just double click, click on tile map, double click, and then it's going to bring you to a screen that looks like this. And from here, just open up after you download the sprite sheet below and import this sprite sheet. We have a solid rectangle, a grass tile, an interesting red rectangle here, and we have some top grass tiles to use. Now, the first thing I want to do here with the tile map object is I want to drag it out onto the screen. And you're going to notice that it's going to automatically size to the layout size, which is the same as the window size, which is kind of beneficial if you had a larger layout and if that's how large you wanted your map to be. I'm going to leave this as that so far, but I'm going to drag it down here. And I already know that these tiles, if I go to the tile map bar, which I have down over here, I already know that these tiles are 16 by 16, so I'm going to set this to be 16 by 16 like so. Now, one benefit or one, I guess, disadvantage is if I wanted to use this grid and make it 16 by 16, it's only going to show up over there and not down here, but that doesn't bother me all that much. So now that these tiles are 16 by 16, I can actually start to use these tiles with some of these tools. Now, admittedly, these tools aren't the best. There's not a lot you can do with these tools, but there's actually more than you might think. For example, if I wanted to make this grass tile go upside down, I can click flip, and then I could have these go upside down. So, and if I wanted to rotate it, I could do the same thing. I want to rotate it again, or one more time. So I could kind of create something interesting with that. But for right now, we're just going to keep it very simple, and I just drew out a very simple dirt with this solid rectangle and then this. So now you might be wondering what these other tiles are doing, or you just might have some kind of questions here. So what I want to point out to you is that our tilemap object and our player object, once we get to that, they're just sprites. They're just placeholders for objects underneath. So this is going to be our map. I'm going to call this O map as object map. But then what I want to do is I want to right click and clone this. So it's using the same tile set here, but I'm going to call this O collision map. And what I'm going to do here instead, I'm going to put this right on top of it, and I'll have to resize that up in a second. Actually here, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to erase all this. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take that interesting red rectangle, and I'm going to put this along like that. I'm going to grab the mouse cursor and make sure that that lines up. Now, I can also snap to grid, so that still works at least. And we can see here that that needs to snap and that needs to snap. And there we go. Now the difference here, and this is actually a big difference and something that we do with our player, is that you want to have underlying shapes do all of the collision to make it pixel perfect, because sometimes you'll get a sprite that isn't a shape, that has a little bit of a tail to it, maybe if you had this grass tile to it. Let me try to select that and show you. So these grass tiles right here are really helpful to kind of give the level something more, but they're not there for collision purposes. They're there for design purposes. So we're going to do something else with them in the future here, but that's just another reason why you want to use basic shapes, because your tiles won't always line up that way. Your animations won't line up that way, especially when it comes to your player and your enemies. You want your collisions to be basic shapes that you know are going to collide when they collide. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to lay this over. I already called it O collision map. I'm going to add this behavior. So the first thing, this is actually, I guess, our first behavior here. You can resize these windows to however you want. I try to keep my windows neat. Let me add right here. I try to keep them within my monitor and within this kind of layout area. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to add our behavior of solid, which is really a construct 2 behavior that makes it so no object passes through. It's extraordinarily useful. And now our collision map has that solid object. Now, of course, I don't want people to see these red tiles, so I'm just going to make this invisible. Now, if you're using the free version of Construct, you're probably going to be limited to how many layers you can use here. So I'm just going to call this, now this would be our UI, like I would designate that for our UI, but I'm actually going to call this our collision map. I'm going to spread these between these two layers. So I'm going to right click on our collision map here, move to layer, collision. I'm going to lock it, and then I'm going to make it invisible. So now the only thing I can see is our unlocked map layer. Okay, so that's how I would set this up. I'm going to try to make sure that I only set up the max is 4 for Construct 2, using 4 layers. I might have to go above for some parallax. So if you have the paid version of Construct 2, you can do so. And there are other ways you can get around that once we get into that. But that is tile maps in a nutshell. It doesn't matter what size they are. It doesn't matter what size the layout is. It's just how you want to design your level. One quick thing before we do go is this. So right now we don't have a background color other than on our collision map. So I'm going to select the collision map and I'm going to say transparent yes. So that white goes away. I'm going to go to our map here and I'm actually going to grab the color that I want to be in the sky. Give me 1 second as I grab that. Okay, so this background color right here is going to be the color of the window. And I haven't hit play yet because all it's going to show is hello world. I'm going to go to other, custom, and I'm just going to type in my background for once we add in our background at the end here. So this is also going to reflect the sky color. So 196 for red, 235 for green, 242 for blue. And then I'm going to say transparent, no. So now you can see that our window size reflects that color. I can hit save, and I'm going to hit play. And all you should be able to see here is the 1280 by 720 with the blue window. So we haven't actually gotten to our tile map yet, but if I wanted to just show this to you real fast, I can just move this up, and you should be able to see it within the window size. So I'm going to put that back for now, and we will address that in the next lecture. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. In this lecture, we're going to add in our player object. To do this, I'm going to add in a new layer. I'm going to rename this player, and I'm going to double click. Oh, you know what? Let's lock our map layer, and I'm going to double click on our player layer and add in a new sprite. And what I want to do here is I want to change or resize the sprite height and width to be 12 by 12. Now this is a very small sprite on purpose. For our purposes, I've created a very tiny character, so I was able to draw it myself. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to just take this color, I like this color, and I'm going to make this a solid rectangle. I'm going to double check the collision points here, and I'm going to set, this is probably the most important part, I'm going to set the origin point by right-clicking on the origin name, quick assign, and going to the bottom. Now by doing this, it snaps this object to the bottom of the grid. So if I still have snap to grid on, which I do, you'll notice that when I actually push this up here, it's on the bottom part of the grid. If this was in the middle, it would be in the middle. I held down control. I don't think I meant to do that. It would be like this. So we put snap to grid back on. Now you're probably wondering, this isn't much of a player. This is actually going to act as our player mask. So I'm going to call this O mask. And virtually everything will be filtered through our mask, because our mask will handle our perfectly rectangular collisions, which is what we want. Now we're going to have to do some resizing once we add in our player animations, but for right now we're going to leave this as it is. Now the two things we need to do here are we need to add two behaviors to our mask. So I'm going to click on behaviors. I'm going to add in, the first one will be the platform behavior, and then the second one is going to be the scroll to behavior. Now the scroll to behavior is what's going to allow us to scroll past these edges and with unbounded scrolling to yes. And it's going to come down to our player and track our player's movements. Now by default, we have a max speed, acceleration. We have all these really cool properties that the platform behavior gives us. So if you're just starting out and you don't know how to program, this is probably going to be the biggest lifesaver for you. And what I can really say about the platform behavior is it just takes a lot of tweaking until you get it right. So I'm going to leave it as its default settings for now. And by having the initial state to enabled, it's going to allow me to use the arrow keys. And I'm going to hit play. And just like that, we should have our player. Now, I'm actually not sure why that window is all dark. Ah, that's because that should not be transparent. Maybe I undid that. But here we go. We have our player. Now you're going to notice a couple things here. That default, we're just not, that's not anything that we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab our player. I'm going to put this to slower settings. I'm going to make it 115. This is honestly just a number that I picked after testing it and testing it and testing it. I kind of go for 115 to 125. It depends on how high up your pixels are, how much speed you want to get, especially when it comes to the jump strength here, where, as you saw before, I was jumping into the clouds. I'm only going to let us jump 250 pixels per second. Everything else I can leave for now. If you wanted to, you can mess around with the double jump. You could turn that to enabled, and then you can hit the up arrow twice. Let me hit play. And now I kind of move at a much easier pace, and I also jump at a much easier pace here, where you can actually see the tiles and you don't jump into the stratosphere here. So that is how we can add in our player. It's very basic, but this is going to get the job done, and it's going to be pixel perfect. Thank you so much for watching this lecture. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.